Greetings, Sifters, and welcome to Ask Shane Anything, episode 140. That's right, we've done 140 of these. Never would have dreamed that when I started the show that would happen, and it did happen because so many of you awesome people are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/sifted. Because of that, this show happens now. This show can happen without questions, so head on over to sifted.net. Click the link in the header there. It'll take you to our forums where you can ask me questions about literally anything. We have another great set of questions this week. Let's get to them. Our first question this week comes from prolific Ask Shane Anything contributor, Kevin. What do you do with old gaming hardware when new ones are released? Do you keep your Nintendo Switch when the Switch 2 is being released? Or do you sell the first Switch or give it to someone? Well, generally I would say that it's a case-by-case basis. I think that's accurate. However, I feel like that's only been the case over the last 10 years or so. And a lot of that has to do with backwards compatibility. So I still have my Atari 2600, my ColecoVision, my Intellivision, my NES, my Super Nintendo, my N64, my GameCube, my Genesis, my PlayStation 1, my PlayStation 2, my Xbox 360. And that's kind of where everything started changing after that generation. So I always kept those consoles because I'm like, well, I have all these games for this console. I may want to play them again someday. And so I'm going to keep this console in case I want to bust it out again. So I box it up. I keep all my stuff. All my consoles, like, they are literally like they're brand new. I keep all the paperwork, all the boxes, everything. When I'm done with the console, I box it up. And I used to just put it in the closet. And I would think, oh, I'll come back to that someday. I have really never come back to any of them. So my thinking back in the day was, I'm going to need it to play these games. But then backwards compatibility became a thing. And since that's happened, now I really struggle to understand why I'm keeping a hold of these consoles. Like the PS3, I was like, oh, it's backwards compatible with PS1 and PS2, and I'm going to need that someday. As it turns out, I didn't need that someday. I think I've used that backwards compatibility like maybe 5 or 10 times ever. And now we're with the PS4 and the Xbox One, the Xbox Series, PS5. Everything's backwards compatible now. I can basically stick any Xbox disc in my Xbox Series X and play it, for the most part. So there's really little reason to keep consoles anymore. So now that you don't need to keep them, what do I do? A mix of things. Sometimes I sell them. My Xbox One, I sold that on eBay, and I was surprised I got anything for that. So I sold that one. My PS4, I gave that to Vincent so he could help with coverage. So I do sell them or I give them away. So you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Going forward, what am I going to do? Like, what about my Switch OLED when I get the Switch 2? I'll probably sell it too, because the Switch 2 is backwards compatible with Switch and all the other things. So the Wii, maybe I'll keep forever because it's backwards compatible with GameCube, although I think GameCube with progressive scan cables actually looks better than the Wii with progressive scan cables. I don't know if I'm right on that, just my eye tells me that. I've kept all my legacy consoles, and now I'm at the point where I'm like, yeah, do I really need all these? Probably not. Consoles that I'm buying now, I'm probably just going to sell them. I don't really see their value rising over time. I mean, heck, an N64 is still dirt cheap on eBay. It hasn't risen in value, and they only sold like 26 million of them. So I don't think any of these consoles that we're buying now are going to be worth something in the future. So I'm either going to sell them or give them away. But yeah, backwards compatibility basically made keeping old hardware a bad idea. Next up, we have a question from Jaylin. Can you show us some of your graffiti art? Did you sneak around to apply your art to public or private property? Was it ever dangerous? Okay, Jalen, I've brought up that I was a graffiti writer a bunch of times. In actuality, I probably wrote graffiti, if I really think about it, like going out and doing it, for probably 2 years, maybe less than that even. I had been into graffiti ever since I was like a kid, basically. When breakdancing started happening and that whole hip-hop culture thing took off, I was a breaker. I would write graffiti stuff in my notebooks when I was like 8. So I have and I don't have those here with me, unfortunately. But I have graffiti art that I did when I was young, like trying to figure out what the heck they were doing. I have watched Beat Street 300 times, maybe. So I was into it at a very young age, but I never did it until I moved to Philadelphia and I started being around graffiti writers. Now, A lot of my friends wrote graffiti for a long time before I ever had the guts to do it, honestly. And I do understand the whole angle of it, that it is a criminal activity, and it is kind of one of those things that I regret doing in my life, as far as going out and writing graffiti in public instead of just doing it in notebooks. But you'll never learn how to write graffiti unless you go out and do it. That's just the truth of the matter. So do I have books? I do. They're all at my mom's house. When I finished college and before I moved out to California, I dropped a bunch of stuff at my mom's house and just left it there because I didn't want to bring it out here with me. My graffiti stuff is one of the things. However, I do have a couple examples. So here is a tape case, a tape label design that I made for my very first house mixtape when I was trying to become a house DJ back in the 90s. So I did all the art for my sleeves, and here is the art for my first sleeve. And that was kind of the style of my graffiti. Lots of aliens, lots of hearts, and lots of love. Was kind of my style. Now, I never did a lot of burners. Burners are like the pieces that are full train cars in length and height. So I did throw-ups. Throw-ups were like elaborate versions of your name. So my graffiti name was Fire, and I'll show you right now what my tag was. And tag is just how you quickly throw up your name, and here it is. So my name was Fire, and I would go out and just write fire really big, and I had like this whole thing that I would do with flames around it and everything. Graffiti writers, you learn how to do things really well, and you keep doing them, and then over time you learn how to do something else, and then you keep throwing that up. It's a whole thing that you will never understand unless you do it, because you're under pressure while you're writing, of being arrested. So you need to be able to perform under pressure, but you also have to be smart. You need to find places where there's not a lot of traffic for cops. You need to find places where it's dark so people driving by can't see you. But I'll be honest with you, sometimes you just have to go for it. You just have to be like, you know what? I don't care if someone sees me. I got to finish this piece off. And you just do it. And then you run. So what happened for me with graffiti was, in Philadelphia, there was this prolific writer. His name was Credit. And he would put up pieces that were literally his name, like 50 feet high and 100 feet wide. I'm not exaggerating. He was insane. He used like paint rollers. He was a legend. Everybody who wrote graffiti in Philadelphia in the 90s was like, Credit is a freaking god. And one reason I don't feel terrible about writing graffiti in Philly in the 90s is that the entire city was just covered in it. And maybe that's the wrong angle to take, but truth be told, I didn't feel like I was causing that much of a problem because it was such a huge problem already. And again, maybe that's a juvenile way to look at it. But anyway, the city was just covered in graffiti at that point. And the city of Philadelphia got sick of it. And they started this graffiti task force. And they created these mandatory 5-year prison sentences. Like, I think it was like your second offense or whatever. You got 5 years in prison. And we kind of ignored that as well. And then Credit got arrested. They tracked him through the snow. He was riding in the snow, and he put up a piece, walked to a wall a couple blocks away, and started working on another piece, and they just followed his tracks through the snow and found him. And he got 5 years in prison. And everybody I knew quit. So if you don't think that prison time is a deterrent that will stop crime, it absolutely is. After I learned that Credit got arrested, I never put up another piece. You may ask why don't you have photos? One, nobody had cell phones with cameras. No one even had really cell phones. Like, I had one of those Nokia 5150s or whatever at like the end of the 90s. But this was like the middle, early 90s I was doing this. Nobody had cameras. And then if you go out and you take a picture of your piece, they're like, oh, well, you wrote that. That's you. You're the guy who put this up. So nobody took photos of their stuff back then. I do when I go back to Philly sometimes. I try to like drive around and look for places to see if any of my pieces are still there, and I have not been able to find one. It looks like they've all been painted over, either by other graffiti artists that have come after me, or by the city that have just painted over with rollers. So was it dangerous? Absolutely it was dangerous. It was, the bigger danger wasn't even the cops. The bigger danger were the people. So you have to write graffiti late at night, and I would be walking around some of Philly's most dangerous ghettos, skinny white kid, walking around at like 3 and 4 in the morning, like writing graffiti, and you come into contact with people you do not want to come into contact with. Now, one thing I will say is some of the people in those neighborhoods, when they found out that you were out there writing graffiti and weren't like looking for drugs or whatever, they kind of left you alone. They'd hear the cans like shaking in your jacket, and they'd be like, oh, I know what you're doing. And they'd kind of leave you alone. But there were definitely times where I had people following me through neighborhoods, or people say stuff to me, and I would just honestly say nothing and act like I didn't see him or hear him and just keep walking. And then the danger of getting to some of the spots, we'd have to climb You have to take like blankets with you to put over like fences so you can climb over fences. One time I hurt my leg jumping over a fence. I landed wrong, and then I had to get back up over the fence with a busted up knee. It's dangerous. There's no doubt about it. Some of the more prolific writers that I knew in Philadelphia were taking grapple hooks out to write with them. And they would throw the grapple hook up and climb with a rope up the side of buildings. Or they'd scale poles and get up and throw up pieces on billboards. It is very dangerous. And I don't recommend anybody does it in 2025. The other thing too is that graffiti has changed now. Like there are permission walls everywhere where people are just like, just go put something up. They're all over LA where you can just go and write and it's not illegal. And that's been happening in a lot of cities around the US. And obviously I think people just respect graffiti as art now when they really didn't in the 80s and 90s. So there's been a shift and it's pretty cool now. You can just go on YouTube and you can just watch great graffiti writers do their thing instead of having to see what they did in the morning after they went out in the middle of the night to throw something up. So times have changed. Do I regret graffiti writing? It was a blast, honestly. I mean, your heart would just pound while you were doing it. Worried about a cop driving by or someone driving by and contacting the police. And then the next morning, getting up and then going back to look at your piece in broad daylight to see how it turned out. Because at nighttime, you can't really tell. It is a whole thing. And again, in 2025, if you want to get into it, just use permission walls. Have one of your parents let you use the back of their garage or something. Graffiti stands out a lot more now than it did before because most cities have kind of cracked down on it. So anyway, that's part of my graffiti story. I don't know if I'll ever tell anybody the whole story until I write my book. Okay, our last question for this week's episode comes from Zet Saber. Valve is releasing the source code for Team Fortress 2, and EA is releasing the source code for Command & Conquer games. Are we seeing a return in the gaming industry where more source codes to dead franchises will be released so that gamers can host private servers and maintain game preservation? This is where I remind you that sometimes if you get into good trouble, meaning if you raise a ruckus in the right way and you're not a jerk about it and you just point out the facts and the truth about something, a lot of times good things happen. And that is what is happening with game preservation. I feel like there's been a full court press for game preservation now for a couple years where people are like waking up and being like, wait a minute, like this is the history of the industry here that's slipping out of our fingertips. So I think that these groups that have been pushing for this, it wasn't immediate that they got the results that they wanted. It took time and it took persistence. And that is what you have to do when you're protesting. You can't give up and you can't say, oh, we didn't make any gains today, I quit. You can't do that. You have to keep pressing and you have to do it as an adult. You can't be an idiot and call people names and try to make change. You have to point out the truth and the facts to them and keep doing it, and eventually you'll get the change that you want, and that is exactly what's happening with game preservation. I mean, look, if EA, of all publishers, suddenly woke up to the idea that it has this huge back catalog of games that could just slip away, then everybody's thinking about it, because EA, notoriously, has not cared about its back catalog at all. It has all these great studios that it used to have anyway, that it just dissolved, and their games are just kind of lost into the ether. They're not making sequels for them. The IP is like dead. EA is the king of not caring about preservation, and now all of a sudden it does. So if you're one of the people who has acted like an adult and not flared off or been a juvenile idiot when you contacted these publishers, congratulations, you have made a difference. If EA is doing this right now, everyone's going to start doing it in the future, and that is a good thing. And I'll say also for myself personally, I have a metric ton of game code from 1999 until basically 2013, 2014, just tons and tons of preview code for games that never came out. And eventually one day I will sort through all that stuff, I will find the stuff that actually matters, and I will send it to some preservation society where it can be preserved, and they can hopefully rip those discs and preserve those games on those discs that never ended up being released. I'm hoping other journalists are doing the same thing that I'm doing. We'll see. But I think in general, there is just a new push to make sure that this still fledgling industry's history is not wiped clean by the sands of time, basically. And that is what's happening. People just forget. We can't let people start to believe that video games are disposable. It is an art form, and we need to preserve it as such. And people like you, sifters, people who are persisting to push this with publishers are finally making a difference. Okay, that's it for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything, episode 140. It's crazy that we've made it all this way, and that's because of you. If you like this show and you want to see it continue, head to patreon.com/SIFTD, that's SIFTD. Give us a $7 a month pledge there, and I guarantee you this show will keep going. And if you can't afford that, for $4 a month, you get all our content early, including this show. We don't hold this from our other patrons. We just thank the patrons who do give us $7 a month or more. So thanks for watching. We'll see you next week for episode 141.